Hey everyone, this is the fifth week of our series entitled She Speaks, and we are looking at a lady in the New Testament in Acts chapter 16 whose name was Lydia. Lydia was a wealthy business owner in the city of Philippi, and she is responded to the gospel preached by Paul and his team there. We know that Lydia was the first person really recorded that responded to the gospel on Paul's second missionary journey, and really the first convert, if you will, in Europe. And so she's a really integral part to the spread of the gospel. After receiving the gospel, hearing and then believing the gospel, she responds with obedience and then just unbelievable hospitality and generosity. And in that way, she's an example to all of us. There's a lot of texts we kind of looked at in the sermon this week that show that God intends for his people to practice hospitality on a regular basis. A number of different places in the New Testament that charge us to do that. And Lydia, again, is just a great example. It says that after she believed the gospel, that she invited Paul, Silas, the whole team really that were there with them, to come and to stay with her, not just to have a meal and hang out for a while and then send them on their way, but she literally invites them to come stay with her for an indefinite period of time in her home. And so after Paul and Silas then, they're thrown in prison. After they get out of prison, in fact, they go back to Lydia's house and they greet the brothers there, which means they stayed long enough to found this church, and that her home, Lydia's home, most likely was sort of the home base, if you will, of this church plant in Philippi. And so what we see from Lydia really is just unbelievable hospitality and generosity that overflow as a result of the gospel taking root in her life. I compared that a little bit to kind of how our church got started over 14 years ago. There were some really amazing people in our core group, and if I could define them with just a word or two, I think it would be pretty accurate to say they were people of unbelievable hospitality and generosity. And so one of the things that I had said this week was, when you have a group of Christ followers who are willing to practice radical hospitality and generosity toward others, there's really no limit to what God can do through them. And Lydia, again, is just a perfect example of that in Acts chapter 16. So here are some questions for you to discuss this week in your groups. Obviously, the first one, what was the most interesting or encouraging thing to you about the sermon this week? Number two, what was the most challenging thing to you about the sermon this week? Number three, go back and read Acts 16, 11 through 15, Lydia's conversion there. Verse 14 says that Lydia was a worshiper of God and that the Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. So what do you think it means that God opened her heart? And then what does it look like for us to have an open heart to the things of God? What does that look like for us? Number four, if we're honest, I think most of us probably know someone like Lydia. Someone who seems to be a really good person, hard worker, but they just haven't heard or believed the gospel yet. So how can you begin a spiritual conversation with them? How can you begin to share the gospel with them? I know for some people, the idea of starting that conversation is really hard. And so take some time as a group and just encourage one another and maybe talk about how you can begin a spiritual conversation or begin to share the gospel with someone whose heart might be open to that. And then finally, number five, tied to the action step. So the action step this week is to practice hospitality, to think of a specific or tangible way to show hospitality to someone. So as a group, take some time and discuss some specific or tangible ways that you can practice hospitality towards others, particularly outsiders, those that maybe you're not a part of your group, maybe not a part of the church, or may just be lost. How can we practice hospitality in some real tangible ways? All right. Thanks a lot. Y'all have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week as Sarah wraps the series up for us.